Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest State of .NET webinar, Microsoft Build 2023 Recap. We're excited to have our company's founder and big kahuna around here, Markus Egger, presenting for us, and we've got a winner lined up for you today. Markus and some of our company's senior management attended Microsoft Build last week, and he's here to share with you the latest and greatest announcements from Build. My name is Jim Duffy, and I'm responsible for the marketing and sales efforts for all the Code Group services, including Code Magazine, of course, but the Code Group is so much more than a magazine. The Code Group is comprised of 4 primary divisions: Code Consulting, Code Staffing, Code Training, and of course, Code Magazine. Our continuing mission is to help people build better software. Code Consulting provides a number of services, including building custom software solutions on-prem and in the cloud, including web, mobile, desktop, and IoT, Copilot development and other AI solutions, application security testing services, UI design, modernizing legacy applications, and supporting and maintaining existing applications. Our team of expert developers and consultants are ready to help you with your next project. View codemag.com/consulting for more information. Code Staffing is disrupting the world of software development staffing. Our customers get Silicon Valley quality staff, and our employees get to work in a bleeding-edge tech company with industry-leading benefits, including profit sharing. If you need development help or are looking for a new gig with a company that actually cares about you, check us out today at codestaffing.com. We're hiring across the entire Code Group, and we need you. Check out our current openings at codestaffing.com/careers. We have a number of events coming up, including our Secure Coding for C# developers courses in June and September, and our new full-day Introduction to Development with OpenAI, ChatGPT, Azure OpenAI, and more on June 21st. Join Markus Egger for an entire day as he digs deeper into AI concepts, tools, and coding samples. For more information and to register, head over to codemag.com/training today. Code Magazine is written by expert developers for developers. All registered attendees who don't already subscribe to the magazine will automatically receive a free digital Code Magazine subscription. I've included a free subscription link here for you to freely share with others who couldn't make it to this webinar. Just a reminder that the Code mobile app is available for both iOS and Android. It's the ideal way to read Code Magazine on the go. Cyber threats and breaches are in the news almost daily. How secure are the applications you've developed? Our code security team provides application testing services to fulfill our commitment to making your company and its applications more resilient against future attacks and threats. Our expert consultants are experienced in identifying security vulnerabilities in your products, your services, and your application's architecture. Learn more at codemag.com/security. Only 5 very short slides left, and one of them has to do with you winning $100. Just a quick shout out here about Photino. Photino is an open source project the code team is involved with that allows .NET developers to create native cross-platform desktop applications using web development technology. You can leverage your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills to create desktop applications that run on Windows, Linux, and the Mac. It's like Electron, only smaller and much more lightweight. Learn more at tryphotino.io. If you like what you see today or have seen in our prior webinars, please ring that bell and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and follow us on LinkedIn. The slides and recording of today's webinar, and all our webinars, will be available on the State of .NET page on the Code website. All registered attendees will receive a post-webinar email with links to the survey and the slides. Here's the slide about the $100 I mentioned. We would like your feedback about this webinar in the form of a quick survey, and we're willing to pay $100 in the form of an Amazon e-card to one lucky attendee. A lucky name will be drawn from the list of submitted surveys. The survey link is on the slide, and we'll post the survey link in the chat window as well. My last slide. Our presenter today is Markus Egger. Markus is the big kahuna around here. He's Code President and Chief Software Architect, publisher of Code Magazine, international author and speaker, Microsoft Regional Director, and a very knowledgeable and talented developer, and he's also our resident expert in all things AI related. Oh yeah, and he's an awesome boss as well. Welcome back if this isn't your first Code webinar, and thanks for joining us if it is your first Code webinar. We're glad you're all here. Take it away, Markus.
Well, thank you, Jim. Hello, friends. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. I see in our list of attendees, we have a large group of people from all over the place. So exciting to see you all. Obviously, it's exciting times. We got a lot of interesting stuff going on. We did a whole bunch of webinars recently, so if you are interested in any of those, go and check those out. There's a lot of interesting content. But today we are here to talk about what happened at Microsoft Build. So Build to 2023 in Seattle just happened. As Jim said in the intro, we had a number of people there. It was a very exciting event to attend. So what I want to do here is recap the most important Build announcements. Now, one of the things I had planned for this was to kind of split this talk in half and do one half of the announcements that are AI related, and then one half that is not AI related, like .NET and similar announcements. Well, as it turned out, that's really not possible anymore, because these days it's just entirely about AI. Build was 99% about AI technologies, and we'll talk about why that is. Some people might even get tired of more AI announcements, but I think you better get used to the idea, because going forward, that's pretty much what it's going to be. So we'll talk about an era of Copilot. We'll talk about an era of OpenAI, and have a helper in the back who just came in and communicated something to me. Microsoft phone's a little low. Okay, we'll try to. Well, it's already at max, so I'll try to talk a little louder. So in any event, we're talking about a lot of AI in the OpenAI space, also known as ChatGPT, but of course a lot of that is really Azure. So that's what I'll do a lot here today. Initially, we'll talk about some of the things that happen at Build and kind of recapping that. I'll also point you towards some further interesting things that I recommend you watch, because a lot of the Build stuff is available online, and you can watch it for free. But we'll also go into a lot of real-world examples, things that that we do in production today that use the same technology, because I know you guys always like seeing a lot of that, seeing the real-world stuff. And so we'll talk a lot about that. Now, a little side note, this is a live event. I'm coming to you live. This is not recorded. I'm not reading the YouTube chat, but I have my people that are. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask those questions there. If they can't answer it directly, they'll pass it on to me. So I'll be looking over here to my left, and that's where I'm getting my questions. So if you have any questions, I'll try to answer those throughout the presentation. And also afterwards, I'll stick around as long as there are questions, and I'll try to manage the number of questions that are coming in. So were there any announcements that were not AI related? Well, there were a few. There's a few things now in Windows, like this thing called Dev Home. Oops, not what I wanted. Dev Home, which is a new thing that we have in Windows 11. It's a dashboard for developers that allows you to do things like monitor your machine, monitor your Git repositories. It's going to be an open thing that have plugins, so all kinds of development stuff is going to happen over here. We get with this Dev Home thing, we get the ability to set up developer-specific things on the machine, like parts of a hard drive, for instance, that are handled slightly different as far as virus checking and performance goes and so on. So kind of a nice thing to have. I'm actually fairly excited about this. So that was one of the announcements that was not AI related. There's also some announcements around .NET 8, although the big .NET 8 announcements are going to come in the fall. So we'll, of course, have a new release of .NET 8 in the fall, in the November-December timeframe, as always. There's going to be new stuff about .NET MAUI for the multi-platform application UI. There's going to be new Blazor stuff and so on. But frankly, there really wasn't a whole lot about that at Build. Build was pretty much 100% about AI. Now, Build actually took place as a live event, happened in Seattle at the new Seattle Convention Center. So Seattle actually built a new convention center in the middle of the pandemic, which is surprising in a way. Of course, it was started before the pandemic. Very nice event space. So we were there in person, but it's actually a hybrid event, which means you can attend Build online for free, or you go there in person, and of course then you have to pay. It's not a cheap event, but I have to say it was a super exciting event. It was smaller than the Builds pre-pandemic for a number of reasons. First of all, the venue was smaller, so I think it was planned to be smaller. Secondly, it wasn't announced that far ahead of time, and of course being able to attend it online is nice as well. But I have to say I was super excited to be there in person, to see a lot of old friends again, to talk to people in the hallway, to have discussions over dinner and lunch, to see what people are actually excited about, to see what people are using. The excitement level was incredible at this build. It was very well done. I have to say, kudos to Microsoft. The keynotes were great. That's one of the things, spoiler, I can tell you right now, I recommend that you go and watch at the very least the keynotes online. Day one, it's basically a 2-hour keynote split into a number of multiple parts. You can go to build.microsoft.com. It's definitely not a waste of your time to watch the day one keynote, and the day two keynote, especially the second half, was excellent. So people came out of that with a lot of excitement. It was a truly a landmark type of event, I would like to say. So great to be there in person. But if you can't be there in person, I recommend that you at least watch the online stuff. And if you can, next year, it's going to be another one. And I think it's also going to be very exciting. So what we are talking about at this build, there was one big theme that happened at build. And that is the era of Copilot. The era of AI, if you want, but specifically Copilot. This new time where we move into a way of using computers where we always have a Copilot at our side, a piece of AI that doesn't take over, but a piece of AI that guides us through using our applications. And we've now heard a lot about this. If you've watched some of my prior presentations, you are fairly familiar with what this is. But I think we can't overstate the importance in paradigm shift for that. And that takes hearing it a number of times, that takes playing with it, that takes using it, that takes developing with it. But the key part here is that we are moving from a world that we've known for 50 years in software development, which is a world where we've created certain features and then users use those very specific features. Those specific features had specific outcomes that were very well defined, and we could then subsequently use one of those features after another to achieve our ultimate goals, such as sending an email, writing a Word document, using our business application, using our phone to do whatever. All those different generations of software for the last 50 years, so probably, not a lot of us have a career that goes back further than that, I would imagine. So everything that we've seen in our careers was variations of that. Now, of course, it varied considerably back from mainframe days to DOS to early versions of Windows to more advanced graphical user interfaces to web to mobile to touch, all of that. But at the end of the day, they all shared this fundamental characteristic of it being software that's a set of features that users can then learn how to use and then use step by step to achieve a goal. And that has just completely changed to something that's Copilot driven, where we essentially state what the goal is, and a system that is at least somewhat intelligent then goes and figures out how to do that. It interprets what we want. It can respond and converse intelligently or coherently at the very least. It knows the intent that we have. It knows the things that we are trying to drive, and it knows how to achieve that result. So there's a number of steps in there. Some of those steps involve technologies such as OpenAI's ChatGPT type of large language model type of technology, but there's really a little bit more to it, and we'll talk about that throughout this presentation today. But this shift from this very well-defined set of features into a world that's a lot more fuzzy, where we just state our intent and then we'll get a result, and the result's not as well defined as pressing a button to save a record or update a record or something like that. But at the same time, these responses we're going to get and these results that are in key characteristic more like interacting with a human, where you don't necessarily get the same response every time, or you never get the same response when you ask the same question twice, but it's still a very, very useful response and a much more useful and productive response than we had in the past. So this change in paradigm is really something that none of us have ever seen in our careers, I would say. And you could feel the excitement around that at Build. At Build, a lot of people saw a lot of this stuff for the first time, saw it in action, saw how well it works in different applications. and different parts of Microsoft software that is now being put out. But it goes beyond that, as we'll see. It's not just for Microsoft applications. It's a new platform. It's a new way of doing things that all of us will be doing in the future. It's just like at some point we moved from DOS to Windows and everything became about graphical user interfaces. Well, this is the same sort of leap. It's actually probably bigger and it's coming faster, where all of us will be living in this world going forward and will be building applications for that. And the good news is it fits very, very well into the old applications. It's not one of those moves like DOS to Windows where you throw out the old stuff and now you're just going to all the new stuff. Instead, you add this to your existing software. Your current investment is not out the window, but you just add to it and you make people drastically more productive. And so one of the themes that I would say that we had at Build this year was the theme of living through history. It's not often that you live through a moment in history and realize that this is a historic moment in time, but it really is. It really feels like that. And when you develop with this type of technology, one of the things that always amazes me, I've now spent a tremendous amount of time in this. It's been the craziest 2 or 3 months of my career probably, which goes back 30 years. And I'm having a tremendous amount of fun. And the reason for that is that I sit down and I try to build something. And in my entire career, I set myself goals, sometimes stretch goals that were hard to achieve. And when I got close to that, I was very satisfied and it was a satisfying feeling. Well, now I sit down and I set myself some goals and I set up these environments driven by a lot of this technology. And all of a sudden, the result that then emerges, because we're dealing with a world where we have emergent behavior once you set up the fundamentals, the results are just mind-bogglingly more powerful than you ever think you could build. So you end up surprising yourself all the time, and it's just a very, very fun environment to be in. And as you play with this, you realize this is very different from anything that you've done before. Now, I could go on a lot about, the pros and cons about AI and the psychology behind AI and how artificial intelligence really compares with true human intelligence, because spoiler, it's not truly intelligent. It's just a lot of statistical math still, even though it plays a lot of tricks, but they're very, very convincing tricks that lead to just amazing results. Now, I've done several presentations around that. Go watch my recent Code Presents and past State.NET events. I'm not going to do that here today, but it was a theme of those presentations to say, this might be difficult. It might, do away with a lot of jobs and there'll be some hardships. And I still think that. But now that we have a little bit of experience under our belt with some of this technology, I actually see the opposite effect. I see that we are now tackling new things that were completely unattainable before. And all of a sudden, we put a few more people on those tasks, because what was unattainable before and we didn't spend any money on at all of a sudden becomes possible. And yes, the machine does 95% of the work, but we still do 5% more than we did before, and we're paying people to do so. So I'm actually seeing the opposite effect. We're adding jobs to take advantage of all these new opportunities and not removing them, which in a way kind of surprised myself. So anyway, let's talk about this specifically. Microsoft Copilots are now everywhere. That was really the big theme of Build. Copilot features are being introduced into all Microsoft applications. I don't know this for a fact, but my impression is that Microsoft now has this official goal that every product group needs to move onto this new paradigm and onto this new platform. So every Microsoft product that is coming out will, over the next months or so, the release dates are not exactly announced, but over the next months, we'll start introducing Copilot features. Okay, so I see online I'm still quiet. I'm holding the microphone up now. We don't have our usual microphone set up, unfortunately, but this is as loud as I can be, so I'll try to speak as loud as possible. So anyway, Copilot everywhere. Every product group has this goal of adding Copilot to its system, not because this is a new feature, but because Copilot and AI is now the platform that underpins all software. Okay. They are expected to drastically improve your productivity. They already are doing that today. Now, I understand that copilots may or may not be available to people. Some of them are. We'll talk about that. Some of them are coming later. Some of them are probably coming much later. And the reason for that is that this takes a tremendous amount of infrastructure, and I'll show you some information about that here in a few slides. So what you do is you can sign up for some of these. Others, like on the Office platform, you can't even sign up yet, but they are coming in the not too distant future. But sooner or later, every Microsoft product will have a Copilot. And a Copilot is your personal assistant that's always there. And if you haven't seen any of this, I'm not going to go into any of these videos because I've done that ad nauseum in previous talks. But go to news.microsoft.com/reinventing productivity and watch some of those short videos that are there. Now, those videos, they are kind of marketing-y a little bit, but it really does work like they show it. So you have features that are just absolutely mind-boggling as this Copilot AI assistant is helping you achieve your task. People watch it and they say, nice demo, but for my task, this isn't really going to work. Well, here is a piece of news. It is going to work for your task. That's one of the key takeaways from Build, is just how well a lot of this stuff works. And so we can now go through a list of applications that will have that. One of the first apps that became available under this Copilot paradigm, as we now know that it is, was GitHub Copilot. And a lot of you probably already have this available. It helps people write code drastically better. The productivity gains for using Copilot are now measured at 50% plus. Now, of course, that is only for the tasks that you actually use Copilot for. I've had these discussions with people recently where it's, okay, well, my developers are using it. Why are they not 50% more productive overall? Well, if I have a person who spends 2 hours a week developing, well, maybe they're now getting 3 hours worth of work done in those 2 hours. But of course, the other 35 hours or more that they work every week is not going to benefit from that, and we'll need other copilots to help with that. But I think for the tasks that are really done with a Copilot, that number is, if anything, pessimistic. Now let's just go into Visual Studio and let me show you a little bit about Copilot. So I have my Visual Studio open here, and I have GitHub Copilot installed. And what I have installed here is actually Copilot Chat. This is also known as GitHub Copilot X. You can sign up for this. It's the next generation of GitHub Copilot, so we're already on to generation number 2. And the thing about this is you can now either interact with Copilot in your code. So you can come in here and you can hit Alt / to bring up this inline Copilot prompt. Now people say Alt / who came up with that combination? It's easy to remember if you think about it like this. Alt like A, and then / like I. AI, right? So Alt / brings up the AI, and we can now go ahead and ask Copilot questions like, can you explain this code? And it then goes out and it does so. And it over here in Copilot Chat, it explains what this particular code does. Or you can ask a question such as, is there security problems here? Can you find any bugs in here? But you can also do things like you can just start typing in here, and you can say, add more output to the console. And I'm not going to go through a lot of demos here. Inform people about what this does. And you see, immediately Copilot suggests code to me, and I can just hit Tab and accept this code. And this was a very, very simple example. But as you start using this Copilot, and I've recorded short videos about that before, you will discover that it's almost creepy, the kinds of things Copilot knows, because it acts more like a human. It acts more like somebody who fundamentally understands what it is that you are trying to do, and it assists you in that, and it takes away a lot of the mundane tasks. So if I say, I need a method that can create the currently running system processes and take the top 10 processes that consume the most memory and return it back in a way where the most memory consumption process is at the top of the list, and then put it in this list of my special class, it can actually write that for you, and it probably produces a better result than you would, because it considers all these edge cases and so on that you probably don't even want to worry about. And then you let it put in that code, and you probably end up fine-tuning it a little bit, because it is a copilot. It's not autonomous AI that does your job for you, but it's an AI that helps you in the mundane and lets you focus on the important stuff. So that's a very cool thing to have, and it helps you in productivity. It helps you in getting things right. That's another thing. I'm a lot more productive if I get things right the first time. It's not just about how fast do I write it, but also the fact that it is correct. Okay, there's a question online about the ability to disable this stuff. One of the things that people always are worried about is, what happens with my own data? Are they using my data to train things? And the answer is, in the Microsoft universe, no, they're not. Now, of course, if you go into GitHub and you create public repositories that are open source, yes, that is being used for training AIs. And I think there's now settings and how you can tweak that. But it's not your private repositories. And it's also not my discussion. So this interaction here I've just had, where I said, can you explain this code? This does not go into Microsoft's system for further training, because that's my private stuff. And keep in mind that Microsoft's business model is not about selling your data. Now, there's other players in the market. The elephant in the room always is, well, what's Google doing about all this? And Google Bard and all the AI technology they are doing. And that technology is not yet as good as Microsoft. They'll probably catch up to some extent. But the bigger question there, in my mind, is about the business model. Does Google have a business model that will work very well? And do I trust a company whose business model is based around selling ads and data? But Microsoft is different. They would jeopardize this entire lead in the industry they now have. And let's make no mistake about that. Microsoft has just leapfrogged everyone in the industry by moving into a whole new generation of technology. It's moved from that 50-year-old paradigm into the new paradigm, and nobody else has come along with that yet, except for OpenAI, of course, but I'm lumping in OpenAI with Microsoft at that point. But yeah, Microsoft has a lot to lose by giving your data away and almost nothing to win, while that's not true for other companies, which makes me personally very comfortable in the Microsoft environment. So anyway, that's GitHub Copilot, and that was one of the first Copilots we've seen. But now Copilot is moving into all these other environments. So one of the other ones that is available to people is what's also known as Bing Chat or Edge Copilot. If you have any web browser, which I assume everybody does, you can go to Bing, and instead of the old search, you now see Bing Chat, and you can ask Bing Chat anything, like, will it rain today? And it will give me different kinds of answers, and somewhere here is going to be a chat, and we can now get an answer like that. And let's just pick one of those, and you see that it comes up with an AI driven response where it actually understands what I'm trying to do, and it then generates answers, and it comes back with this conversational piece of an answer. And I'm just going to stop it there in the middle of it. That's fine. But the other part of this is that if you are using the Edge browser, so Microsoft's version of Chrome, you now have this Bing Chat button up here. And that is a Copilot built right into the Edge browser. And it ties into the current page that's open. It also lets you chat independently. It lets you compose new things if you need to write something. But in here, you can go ahead and you can ask stuff. You can say, what do you know about Bill Gates? Answer as short as possible, so we don't sit here forever. And it's going to go ahead and it's going to search the web for interesting information. So it's a little bit different from, say, ChatGPT, who I'm sure most of you have probably played with. And it comes up with a meaningful answer that it composes right now as original new content based on current up-to-date information about Bill Gates. And so you have this Copilot built in here, and the exact answer doesn't matter so much, but you get the idea. We now have this, what's often referred to as a sidecar type of interface, which is, by the way, deceptively simple, but it's actually turning out to be pretty hard to build. And in this interface, in this sidecar, we can interact with our AI and get answers that are in many ways much more useful than you would have gotten in the past. And what I have now just naturally gone to using this sort of interface more than anything else. If I have a programming question, for instance, I just go in here and I would do things like, how do I initialize a date in JavaScript? And you see it even helps me type because that's AI driven as well. And it then comes up with a coding sample for JavaScript. Okay. And so that to me is a lot more useful than a lot of the searches we had in the past. So that is another Copilot, an early version of a Copilot that is available to you today. Okay, let's see, there's some questions online. What about the code that is suggested? Could it be proprietary code? What about the Samsung incident? Well, the Samsung incident is something that's become pretty famous at this point. So what happened is a lot of people go to chat.openai.com, which is kind of the root of a lot of this stuff. And so then you go in and you interact with OpenAI's ChatGPT. Is the simple way of saying this. There's a little more to it, but let's just go with that for now. And you can do things like paste source code or have it generate source code or paste in your code and ask it questions about it. Well, if you go to chat.openai.com, that content is not secure. It is expressly stated that the content you put into OpenAI's chat interface, not the SDK, I want to be very clear about that, but the chat interface, anything you put in there is going to be used for further training. So what happened is Samsung engineers did that. They kept pasting their code in and the model got trained on that, and sooner or later it started to spit out code that was very, very similar to Samsung's code. And everybody was very, very surprised. And I guess that's just kind of the growing pains when you use new technology like that. But do not do that. Do not put anything confidential into chat.openai.com. It's not a secret. It will be used like that. So use other alternatives, and then your code won't be ending up training other things. There's also another question here about quality and trust, and not in terms of trusting security-wise, but in terms of what is the answer I'm getting and is it likely right or wrong? That's how I take that question. Now, when you use just chat.openai.com, it's just trained on language, right? That's one of the things to keep in mind is when you use a large language model, it's all about language. That's why it's called a large language model. So it's essentially like training a toddler from age 0 to 100, basically on the world's knowledge base about languages and all kinds of different languages and things that are published, and being able to talk intelligently about literature and just anything else that happened. And it's way beyond what a human can do because it just digests all that information and doesn't forget. But at the end of the day, it's just a language model. And what that means is it spits out statistically probable answers to what you're asking it. It's not even an answer, it's completing what you're saying. It's always adding one more word in a loop to what came before, and it's just statistics as such. And at some point, statistically, it's often just as likely to babble nonsense than to babble real things. And what it takes to prevent that is a few different things. It's grounding it in appropriate data, and it's also about checking what it says and curating that content. And chat.openai.com does none of those things, but other applications can. And I'll show you some examples of that here a little bit later. So the quality goes up considerably. The quality also goes up considerably depending on the model you use. but so does the price. So you have to pick and choose what models you use for what task. But yes, the quality does go up considerably, is the short answer to that question. But just like humans, sometimes they're wrong. I think they're wrong less than humans. So it's a definite improvement. I guess some people say it's superhumanly intelligent in that sense. But yes, sometimes the answer is wrong. So anyway, so that's moving along here. That's Copilot in Edge and chat in Bing and so forth. And we could now go through all kinds of examples. I don't have Copilot in Office at this point, but I have some screenshots here. So this is just a marketing screenshot of Copilot running in Excel. Excel is one of those stereotypical apps that has a million features that most people don't know how to use. So having an assistant that can help you, where you can say, pull this data out of this connected data source, which most people don't know how to do in the first place, and then format it nicely, find interesting information, then create some charts around it, and then maybe take that and put it in a PowerPoint presentation. That's a relatively trivial thing to do if you're using a Copilot in Excel. Okay? And we could now go through different examples. We could go and look at PowerPoint, creating nice PowerPoint presentations based on some information that you have, or based on some information that you want your Copilot to find out or pull from your own marketing documents, or all kinds of data sources, whether they're public or your own, in a private and secure fashion. So there's a lot to that. There's understanding what you'd like to do. There's understanding of the source material. But then there's also the driving of the application, because there's a difference between knowing that you want to make a nice PowerPoint presentation with certain content and then actually doing it and creating a good looking PowerPoint presentation are two different things. So there's more to a Copilot in PowerPoint than just the language model. And that's very characteristic. Once you dip your toes into this world of AI, everything becomes AI. The ability to create something that is good looking or professionally looking is an AI task. It's not a well-defined task, what that means. Finding appropriate information on top of understanding the language that you gave it is another part that's much more easily accomplished with AI. So that's one of the things we see as you are diving into this world. AI consumes everything. Everything that was a fairly standard computing task in the past now becomes an AI task. And that changes the way we develop. It changes the technologies we use to develop, although they tend to be paired up with what we did in the past, which makes it easier. There's also a point that's being made online about GitHub Copilot not being free. That's correct. A lot of this AI stuff takes an enormous amount of infrastructure, and frankly, it's extremely valuable. If you pay 10 or 20 bucks a month for GitHub Copilot, it adds up to a bunch of money. You know, like in my own organization, we are now saying we should give Copilot and a Copilot subscription to every developer. Well, that's a financial decision that needs to be made, but it's now also becoming clear that the improvement in quality and productivity and ability to do things that otherwise you may just not be able to do at all, or that would take you a long time to research, the benefit you get out of something like a GitHub Copilot is way beyond the relatively small amount of money you pay for that. It basically saves you hiring a few people in essence. So we could now go through this. Another example that I think is awesome for Copilot is in email clients such as Outlook. There's really a few different things you can do with Copilot in something like Outlook. It can help you generate an email, and in that case you just have Copilot right in the middle of your email message, almost like GitHub Copilot in Visual Studio, so not necessarily in a sidecar fashion. And it just helps you to make your emails read better, to add more information. When you use it to help you create an email, you can do things like adjust the tone that it speaks in, or how long your email is, and so on. Again, it's a Copilot. It doesn't take over, it assists you. But then there's also another kind of Copilot you can envision in Outlook that is just sitting there in your inbox and say, hey, I have 2,000 messages in my inbox. What are the 10 most important ones? And summarize what they are about. And are they already taken care of, or do I even still need to look at them? those kinds of features obviously are huge productivity gains. So that's another example of something that is happening. Now, to me, almost the most exciting is Copilot on the Power Platform. So low code, no code environments, which are becoming more and more important as we discussed in the past. This does not replace what we're doing as developers, but it supplements especially the front end piece of a lot of the back end things that we are writing now, allowing people to build some of their own apps for the more mundane things. And Copilot really shines in those types of scenarios. It can build entire apps for you. It can adjust apps. It's, some of that we saw it build, but there's a lot more to come, and that's certainly very, very exciting. And then there's a second aspect to Copilot on Power Platform that we've also seen it build, and that is when you have something like Power Virtual Agents, which were these kind of silly little bot interface. That's my personal opinion. I frankly was never very excited about bot interfaces. I hated using them. I hated building them. Well, they have now just totally changed, because now instead of building these quote unquote silly little bots, you are now driving that by Copilot and large language model power. So you can actually create virtual assistants that speak more like a human and are truly useful and knowledgeable, rather than just creating these flows of very well curated bot interactions that frankly never were quite what you actually wanted. So different angles there, and that's showing a characteristic also of these copilots. There is not one copilot in Microsoft products. It's based on the same technology, it's based on the same patterns, the same extensibility points, but each team is creating copilots in ways that make sense for their particular product. It's just based on the same technology, but it's really different copilots. And then one of the most impressive uses of copilots I've ever seen, because it kind of ties it all together, is Copilot in Teams. And this is truly amazing. You can, there's videos that you can watch and stuff that was shown at Build and otherwise, where you imagine a meeting that you may not be able to attend, or a meeting where you show up 30 minutes late. And you can do things like you can say, in this video meeting with all the spoken text that went back and forth, give me a quick summary of what I missed. What were the most important parts? And it does so very reliably. And then you sit through the rest of the meeting and you say, okay, what are the concrete to-do items we got out of this? And it tells you, and it puts it into your app that you use to manage your tasks. And you can then say, now create me a PowerPoint presentation. And maybe this was a sales call, create a first version of my sales document and draw from this other information we have about the products we want to sell. And it creates a 30-page document in Word that lists the most important parts for this particular customer that you just had a meeting with. So look at some of those samples. It is absolutely amazing. So that's that. Now, one of the big announcements at Build, and I was a little surprised that they already announced that, but it's also a very obvious next step, is Copilot in Windows. So here's a screenshot of Windows with a Copilot sidecar going down the right side of the screen, where instead of actually going into a specific app, you just use Windows itself to drive it through a Copilot experience. So instead of hitting the start button and saying, open up my Word application or open up Photoshop or whatever it is you want to use, you just start conversing with a Copilot and you say, I need to work on this logo. First of all, make sure that for the next hour, nobody disturbs me unless it's really important. And then suggest a logo that I need to create, and it makes a suggestion. And then you say, okay, that's nice, adjust it a little bit like this or that. And then open the app you used or you suggest to create that with, and it automates the apps you're using. And then you use Copilot to drive that, and then you save it away and you share it in Teams or in email or whatever you use to share. And that's a very compelling way to go. And it implies a number of things. First of all, it implies that Copilots work outside the apps that they are made for. And it implies that this is a completely open system, which is indeed the case. So that's one of the big announcements that we couldn't really talk about before, but we can talk about now that Build is in the books. Copilots are not just a feature that Microsoft is building into their apps. And that's one of the most important things that I'm going to tell you about here today. So if there's one thing you remember from this talk, it should be this. You will be able to extend this Copilot system, whether that's in Windows, whether that's in apps like Word. So rather than just having a generally knowledgeable Copilot, you can extend Copilots in ways that, for instance, integrate with your in-house software and have institutional knowledge and have access to your data in a way that you entirely control. Right? If there's no privacy, this whole model would fall apart. Obviously, that's at the top of everybody's mind and is a very, very important piece of this puzzle. So extending Copilots will be what a lot of us will be doing for a long time to come. So a few questions online. Do you see Copilot attaining the ability to support pair programming? Yes. In fact, GitHub Copilot is often referenced as paired programming with a virtual second character. Okay? So yes, it can do code reviews and advise what you should do in your code. And again, if that becomes extensible and you can add your institutional knowledge, you start to see how powerful this is. Okay? Question about Copilot and Power Apps. Will it be able to bulk fix items that prevent solutions from being exported? Yes, absolutely. There's really, if it can be done in Power Apps and you can code it, Copilots can do it too. It's a completely often system. And there's a question on how can I turn on Copilot in Windows? Well, that's that's the $1,000,000 question. Literally, is when will we get our hands on that? And there's no current timeline. What I would expect is that this is a waitlist style situation where more and more people will be brought on to use this, and how that's decided and who is picked, I've been somewhat critical about in the past, but we don't really know how that's going to happen. But it's also to some extent the reality of the situation with having a AI-driven system that's enormously resource intensive, and that just the infrastructure is not there yet, and I'll talk about that a little more. But anyway, so Copilot in Windows is probably one of the most significant announcements in the extensible Copilot platform, because this will drive what we do in the future. And you can now think this further and you can say, okay, well, now if you have Copilot, why would I ever hit the start button and bring up an app? Wouldn't I just always drive things through Copilot? Well, I think we will probably get to a world where it's not just the sidecar with a little bit of Copilot features, but where we, instead of hitting the start button, actually bring up a Copilot environment, and it's mainly the operating system is mostly a Copilot unless you have exceptional cases. Kind of like right now we sometimes dip back into the command line and do Windows terminal stuff, and us developers like doing that, but our parents probably do not. They use the graphical user interface. So those low-level capabilities are still there. I could definitely see a world in the future that's mainly Copilot driven, and you'll only go into the low level, which is what we consider applications today. We'll only dip into that when we have exceptional cases. So you can kind of extrapolate, and then you can even put in question, well, what is the concept of an application even? If I had something like an expense tracking app, do I build an expense tracking app where I can say, add a receipt, here's what it was for, here's the amount, maybe attach a photo? Or can I just snap a picture of my receipt and share it into Copilot and it figures it out? And if it can't, it'll just ask a few more questions. So a lot of that is up in the air. We don't know how that's going to go, but it's certainly we can dream at this point. And I think what we'll see in a year, 2 years, 5 years, none of this stuff is going to be recognizable to us compared to where we're at today, but this technology will take us there. So a little bit about the different paradigms. When we talk about Copilot, people have relatively specific ideas at this point what it's going to be. If you're coming from GitHub Copilot, you're probably used to it being more like IntelliSense on steroids, just inside your editor. If you're coming from something like the Copilot in Microsoft Edge, you're already familiar with the sidecar approach, where it's just a pane down the right side typically. But we'll see different variations on how Copilots work. We'll see the typical sidecar approach. We'll see it inside an app, which will make more sense for things like GitHub Copilot, email Copilot, Word type of Copilots. Power Platform works a lot like that. But then we'll also see Copilot just outside your applications, like the Windows Copilot, where it's just driving a plethora of different apps and things you may want to do. And again, the concept of an app might then even be put into questions. Question online is, what are the scenarios, tasks for which GitHub Copilot is not well suited today? My experience as a senior dev was that I had to spend a lot of time reviewing and correcting its suggestions and hallucinations. Well, yeah, it learns on code that's out there, and if that is nonsense, it often comes up with stuff that's not that good, or it may encounter scenarios where it's just not that good, just like people, right? That's really the kind of things that we need to compare to. It's I noticed that the expectations of a Copilot are that it's always right, and if it makes some mistakes, then it says, oh, it's not that smart. I had a discussion with a friend recently who used a Copilot, and he wanted a Copilot to figure out, in this case, a mathematical thing. He said, I'm racing down a drag strip, the quarter mile. It takes me 10 seconds. How fast do I have to go at the end of it to make it in 10 seconds through the quarter mile? And the AI essentially went through it and figured out how fast do you have to go on average. And you had to go back and say, no, that's not right. You're starting at 0. And then it figured it out, and he said, well, that's not particularly smart. And that's our perception. But when you really think about what happens, is the fact that you can converse with the computer and make it figure that out at all in English terms was complete science fiction a half a year ago. And the fact that you can then make it go through and say, well, figure out a formula and then reason through the formula and then come up with that and then write me a program that does it, and then it gets it right, 30 seconds after it failed the first time, is really very, very amazing, and probably beyond what most people could do in the same time frame on their own. But it's not always right, and that's the characteristic of it. Now, an interesting aspect is, if you then ask the AI whether it did it correctly, and it observes its own output, it usually says, oh no, this was wrong. I should have started at 0. Let me do that again. So using AI to check itself is something that I think we'll see more and more. And we're at the very, very beginning of all this, right? We're just a few months in of actually using this in production. This will get drastically better, but I'd say it's already better than people are. But again, it's a Copilot. It's not autonomous AI. You do need to observe what it does. You do need to check it. It just, you're using it to type, and it helps you come up with the majority of the answer. But sometimes you then, or almost always, you tweak some of it. Just like if I go to my coworker and say, how would you do this? And he gives me a suggestion, and then I use it, but I use it for my particular case. So question is, can Copilot remember and use information within a project? I see you guys are, you like Copilot in Visual Studio a lot. So can it use information within a project and between projects? For instance, responding to something like, do the same thing here as we did on Project X. The default Copilot does not, but then again, remember, it's an extensible system, so I think we will see people writing extensions like that are either general purpose or probably even specific to your organization. Like, here's our coding standards, or here's another example of draw. Here's an example app. Always draw from that in how we do stuff. So that's not enabled out of the box, but I think we'll see a lot of that. Again, I think the stuff we'll see over the years here, over the next months even, are gonna be just incredible. So moving along here, view the resulting characteristics we expect from Copilot. A 50% improvement in productivity year after year is what Microsoft is aiming at. Every year, twice as good as the year before, and reducing the costs to 1/10. That's what Microsoft wants to do. Now, is that realistic? I think it's realistic for the tasks that you use Copilot for. And there's some stuff that we are doing where it's just like, okay, I can now do in one sentence what would have taken me a month to do before. Well, yes, that's drastically more than a 50% improvement. Other things, of course, not so much. So we'll see how that goes. But clearly, this wave is amazing. It's coming much faster than any of the previous waves, like web or mobile. It's really changing almost daily. And the characteristic of this is AI is eating the world. It's once you get into AI, almost everything becomes AI. That's the characteristic of this. Again, we're at the very beginning of this. We're basically dealing with the equivalent of toddlers when it comes to AI. but I think they'll grow up very quickly, and over the next year or two, we'll see just drastic improvements. And that's also true for things that have already happened. Like there's plenty of stories about how Bing Chat in the first few days of its existence had issues, like it started hallucinating badly when there's more than 5 round trips, more than 5 back and forth questions. But the thing is, you don't hear about that anymore today. That got fixed within a matter of days and sometimes hours. And so the improvement of this, if, you know, a lot of the shortcomings of AI that you may have heard about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago are now completely outdated and have been solved. It is happening so fast, it's absolutely incredible. Okay. Okay, so we already talked about this. Copilots are extensible, and that's what we'll kind of spend the rest of the presentation on here today. And there's a question online, best practices for Copilot that can be shared across organizations. Well, there's nothing I could just share here as a single sentence answer, but I think yes, the answer is yes. Interacting and learning how to interact with AI is a whole skill in itself, and we'll develop a lot of best practices, but there's nothing that I have ready to go to say, here's a document, use this. But absolutely, we'll be talking about a lot of that in the future. Now, here's a strong statement that I like to make, and it was a controversial statement when I made it 2 or 3 months ago, and I think it's now gotten more and more accepted by more people. We now consider all apps without Copilot features to be legacy. Why is that? It's a strong statement, but I think it's a correct statement. Now, the good news is you don't have to throw your old apps away. You add Copilots to your old apps. But the reality is, if you have an app today, you need to start thinking about adding Copilot, because your competition will kill you if you don't have Copilots. And conversely, if you have an app that dominates the market, let's say TurboTax, if next year's TurboTax doesn't have a Copilot, you probably have a pretty good opportunity as a competing provider of tax software to leapfrog TurboTax. Right now is that time. And you need to think about that both in the positive and negative sense. If you don't have it, your competition may leapfrog you. If you have competition that you want to leapfrog, this is probably a good way to go. And also in terms of using your own in-house software, the productivity gains will be considerable, and you need to think about that. You probably need to add Copilot features to your own app so you can start being more productive than your competition. And it's kind of a, you know, we've been squeezed for productivity for decades now. But I find that this is the kind of productivity that it's actually pleasant to use, because it's not like an individual human is being squeezed to do more with less. But instead, it's you constantly have an assistant who helps you relatively effortlessly leapfrogging your competition. And I'll show you some examples of that. But I think that's really true. So if you have any apps and you're wondering, how can we add Copilot features? What are we doing? Feel free to contact us. We're helping a lot of customers right now with that. In fact, I had a day-long meeting yesterday with the customer about that very topic, and right after this presentation here, I have a meeting with another customer where we are discussing how to help them add Copilot features with a reasonable amount of effort. Right? We're not talking about putting 50 people on a 3-year project. This is, you can gradually start adding that, and it's very, very doable. Okay. So let's talk about how we can do a lot of this. Like, again, you can go watch my recent Co-Present seminar. I talk a lot about the details. You can go to the recording of the prior Stata.NET seminar. We talk a lot about this stuff. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly here. What are our capabilities today in terms of us building that? Okay. So it's important that you understand that Copilots aren't just for Microsoft products, but you can build Copilots on top of this technology. Okay. So how do we do that? Well, we have a few things we can do, and I go into deep and shallow learning into some of our other presentations. What we're doing is we can build existing services into our own apps. That's the easiest way to go. We can use things from the Microsoft Cognitive Service Platform, from Amazon's and many providers' services. We develop against these ready-to-go services. Yes, we can also train our own AIs and models, and we'll start doing that more and more on a small scale. But the big thing right now is using a lot of these pre-trained services, and a lot of it goes back to this new Azure OpenAI services bullet point that it's at the bottom of my slide deck here. So Azure provides a lot of functionality out of the box, and Azure OpenAI, which is what these large language models are, which is what drives ChatGPT, is at the heart of all this. But then you will reach into other cognitive services. And there's a question online about cross-platform developments, like on the Mac. Well, I'm not totally sure what the question is exactly. Can you develop your own copilots if you're a Mac guy and you're using Visual Studio Code? Yes, you can. A lot of this you can do in C#. A lot of it you can do in Python. Those are kind of two key languages, but you can do it in other languages as well. Now, is there a copilot on Mac? Well, Apple doesn't have a copilot. Okay? It has Siri, which at this point looks rather old. But certainly if you are building an app for the Mac platform, it's just a service call. You can reach into the OpenAI platform from a Mac just as well. So absolutely, Outlook on the Mac is expected to have copilots. There's also a question about, I haven't done programming in a while. I'm beginning to learn C#. What training materials can you suggest? Well, what you're doing is you are calling relatively simple AIs. So whether you do C# or Python, they're not going to be very difficult. And I'll show you some stuff here in just a moment. So also, we have a training class coming up in 3 weeks that Jim mentioned in the intro. It's a one-day training class that I'll be teaching, actually. It's the first class I'll personally teach in a long time, where we dive into building copilots in a day. So that might be of interest to you. So let's talk about who this OpenAI thing actually is. OpenAI is an organization independent from Microsoft in a way, that has both a nonprofit and a for-profit arm. It was founded in 2015 in San Francisco with the goal of developing general artificial intelligence, which none of the stuff we're seeing right now is general artificial intelligence, which general artificial intelligence would be something that is as intelligent as a human and thinks in similar ways to a human, which we are not doing and we are generations away from. But they came up with some very interesting stuff, including ChatGPT and including DALL-E and a few others. Also owns 2%, actually, the OpenAI Foundation, I think it's called. So together, Microsoft with them controls 51% of OpenAI, which is why we generally think of OpenAI as a Microsoft endeavor, but that's not totally accurate, of course. It was actually founded by a group of 12 different people, I think. One of them was Elon Musk, but it's not like he was the founder. He's just one of several guys who then also exited OpenAI because he couldn't see its use, apparently, is how the story goes. So I don't know what the real story is, but that's apparently what happened. So what does OpenAI do? Well, they build things like DALL-E. DALL-E is an image generation AI. I'm showing you a magazine cover here that we did last fall. We were one of the first magazines, I think actually the second magazine, who had a completely AI generated cover. What this was, the theme of this particular issue of the magazine was Polars, which is a Python library that is a replacement for Panda. And so we asked DALL-E to draw us a cover from scratch, completely original art that we wanted it to be creative and create this thing. And we said we wanted a polar bear wrestling a panda bear on a sheet of ice in front of the Aurora Borealis. And that's what it created. Created a few other versions as well, some of them humorous. But it created one that was good enough to be put on a cover. So this cover is entirely AI generated by DALL-E. Now, what's more interesting for us here today is ChatGPT. Okay, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. What it is, it's a large language model that generates text output. And I'm sure you've heard about this. I've now done numerous presentations. And every time I ask my audience about it, there's not a single person who hasn't at least tried it out. So it's, I've never seen that before where 3 months after the launch of some brand new revolutionary technology, you don't encounter a single person who hasn't used it. So I'm not going to go into any demos here, but I'm going to point out a few things that are important. What this does is it's a text calculator. It's a statistical probability engine that can predict the next word after prior text. So if I do something like I say I'm climbing up the apple tree and I'm picking an, it will suggest the next word, and as we as humans can deduce, it's probably apple. And if I say I'm climbing up the fruit tree and I'm picking an, it might be orange or apple. It'll still probably be more likely apple, but it could be one or the other. And it then has some randomness built in to do that. Now, of course, it's not just answering in a single word. It's answering in sentences, and it's building stories, and it's sometimes pages of text if you ask it to do so. But that's just running the same functionality in a loop. It's always building just one more word. And it doesn't think ahead and say, this is my next paragraph. It just thinks of one more word. And then sometimes it hallucinates and puts out nonsense. But if you then ask it and say, well, analyze what you just did, is that right? It'll say, oh, no, I got that wrong. Let me redo that. And so the way we see this in ChatGPT, where it just spits out answers and we just let it immediately show that to the world, is perhaps not even the best way to go. Maybe we should let it check its work more often and then present the answer. And so those are things we're currently experimenting with, but it's useful to understand that characteristic of it because it also leads you to things such as chain of thought reasoning. It often does better when you say, explain the process. So if I say, how fast does my race car have to go to make the quarter mile in a drag race? The answer will probably be worse than if I say, how fast will it go? Explain it step by step how you come up with the reason. And so we are learning how to interact with AIs better and how to coax it into better outputs, because it does think, quote unquote, a little bit different than humans do. Okay, so Steve is rephrasing his question. Is it possible to create shareable models for best practices within particular context? Yes, absolutely. That's why Copilots are extensible. So for instance, there's already extension, say, for LexisNexis. LexisNexis is a commercial database that has all American case law, and there's Copilot extensions that are trained for that. So if you used Word and you used the word Copilot, you could add the commercial LexisNexis extension, and it's better at that. And it's absolutely conceivable to make similar things for GitHub Copilot for software developers and anything else really. Okay. So let's move on here. So I already told you what large language models are, so it's always useful to keep that in mind. I want to point out some of the scales that are involved in that. Here are some photos that were from Build. This is actually Scott Guthrie on stage at Build with a display behind him. And what he's explaining here is how a lot of the server setup for the AI stuff works. And here we see 5 different server racks. These server racks have 4 servers each in them, so this is 20 servers. But the servers actually use up the least amount of space in this setup. Instead, what we are seeing here is servers with a lot of AI hardware added, what we would have called GPUs in the past. So things that companies like NVIDIA make that are very, very good essentially at doing floating point math. And the floating point math for graphics cards, as it turns out, is slightly different from floating point math for AI. In particular, we don't need 64-bit floating point math to make AI better. It actually turns out it's more efficient with like 16-bit, and then we can do more in parallel, and it makes almost no difference in quality, but it makes difference in performance. And so what's happening is lots of vendors are now starting to build specialty AI hardware, and that goes into these server racks. And then Microsoft is currently, first of all, the biggest creator of AI supercomputers and cloud-based AI. And they're also using technologies like the InfiniBand wiring, which we see here, which is tremendously important for the performance. And still, we need extremely large setups of this. So one of the things that I can't personally verify, but that stuck with me, that Scott Guthrie told a group of us in an insiders meeting, that I believe is not under NDA because he mentioned it in other places. But it's if you are making a single request into some of these large language models, just the number of cables that are involved in tying all the machines together that are needed to run that, which is a weird stat, but it just somehow stuck with me. And these InfiniBand cables are a big deal. Just the amount of cables involved in that for a single request essentially are way as much as an 18-wheel truck, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what happens when you make a single request into ChatGPT. Now, it runs highly parallel for just a very short amount of time, obviously, but it's interesting to think about that. And so what Microsoft is doing is they're building enormously large data centers. Here's a photo that was shared at Build from the Dublin data center that's currently being built. And if you look at the trucks around this photo, you see the scale of this thing, right? Or these buildings. The data center space in Dublin is adds up to like a mile long and a half a mile wide. 35 football stadiums, not fields, but stadiums is the scale that's often referenced here. And this is going to come online soon. And in fact, Microsoft is building tons of these data centers. Over the next year and a half, about 150 of these data centers are going to come online. Over the next 12 months, 120. Okay, so that means every 3 days, one of these data centers gets completed. And it's not just for AI, but AI is one of the big driving factors for all this. So that gives you a sense of the scale, and that also gives you an idea of why we do not individually train large language models, because it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to train one of these things. So the scale is absolutely amazing, and it gives you an idea of why there's wait lists to get onto certain technologies and why there's no specific release dates, because there won't be one day that it's available. It'll become available in more regions and so on. So helps to understand the scale, even though the scales are unfathomable. I mean, it's just so much infrastructure investment and energy need that goes along with that. Now, Microsoft is committed to being carbon neutral, by the way, and they do a lot of things like the heat that is generated by these data centers. They are used to heat homes in cities. And so Microsoft is committed to being carbon neutral by 2030, I think, across the entire company, not just its data centers, and carbon negative by 2050. In other words, take out all the carbon in the atmosphere that Microsoft has ever produced in its entire company history with everything they ever did. That's their goal. Well, I can just repeat what they're saying. I don't know if they'll get there, but they're very, very seriously committed to this. And yes, data centers will need a lot of energy. The good news is they're not moving around. It's easier to deal with it for something like a data center than it is for something like a truck or delivery van or something like that. So anyway, getting sidetracked here, but just to understand what's going on. Now, OpenAI for developers is an important thing when you build this stuff. Azure OpenAI is one way to get to this. So there's always a lot of confusion around that. There's OpenAI. You can go to openai.com and you can sign up for their APIs. And this is one way of using OpenAI as a developer. And it's a perfectly feasible way that'll have a lot of users. Another way to use OpenAI as a developer is through Azure. Azure OpenAI is essentially very, very similar to the OpenAI SDK used directly, but it's through Azure. So it comes through your regular Azure account. And this is the important thing, it adds all the Azure features. So security, managing things you do, how you pay for it. But also in the future, it'll not just be about running a chat client, because that's a silly little tech demo. But it's making it as a core piece of your platform, and that will then have to integrate with all the other Azure things like databases. And it's not OpenAI's business to provide a cloud that does that. They just provide the AI piece, that's the large language model, or DALL-E and a few others, but not all the other stuff around. So we are mainly using Azure OpenAI because you have to integrate all these other things, and that's the huge benefit you get. But if you have a scenario that's just directly using OpenAI, and that's fine, that's perfectly viable as well. So when you sign up for Azure OpenAI, let me just bring up my browser really quick, you then get things like the OpenAI Playground. And this is essentially giving you access to the underlying technology that's behind a lot of this large language model stuff. So when you go to chat.openai.com, it really is just, like I said, a tech demo for things that are going on behind the scenes. This is another way to get at it with a little more information. So I can go in here And I can say, this is my usual example, I'm climbing up the apple tree and I am picking Anne, and then I can let it run. And this invokes the large language model the same way you do when you go to chat.openai.com and you see here that it answered in a single word, which normally it doesn't, by the way. Normally it's wordier, but I can control it a lot more here. So for instance, I set the system message or system prompt where I can say, hey, behave like this. And that's really what happens behind chat.openai as well. So it allows me to fine tune this here more directly, and I can set other parameters like the temperature. Temperature is a measurement of how much randomness it adds. Like, does it answer apple or orange if the probability of those two being correct being very, very close. And the other thing is I can go in here and I can view the code that it would actually take if I wanted to call this as an API, because this is just a playground for developers that allows me to experiment with something that I would normally do from within my application. And I can then go in here and say, okay, well, I'm a Python developer. Here is the code it would take to do exactly what I just did from Python. Or I'm a C# developer, and here's the code it would take to do that as a C# developer, and using the OpenAI client SDK and so on. So, that's a good way to get into it. And there's a lot to it. There's the different parameters you can set. You also do things like different deployments. What is a deployment? A deployment is basically the setup of your model. So as you can see here, I deployed 4 different models. Well, what does that mean? Well, as it turns out, ChatGPT isn't just ChatGPT. There's actually many different models behind it that are useful for different things. So if I wanted to write a Sherlock Holmesian novel, I will probably use ChatGPT 4 Turbo, which is the most capable model, but also the most expensive to run. If I needed to just tokenize a piece of text, which is a way to turn text into a numeric representation of itself, I can run a very, very cheap and old model. If I wanted it to generate code examples like GitHub Copilot does, I'd use a codex model, for instance. And so there's many different models. They have different characteristics and capability and pricing. And that's a question that was just asked. How do you estimate what this is going to cost you? Well, what you do is you pay for this by the token. When we create something, like say a completion here. Completion is, there's 2 different things. You do chats, which is a lot of back and forth, or you can do completions. Completions is just, here's some text completed. Chat is really repetitive completions. But in any event, you can come in here and you can start playing with this and you can put in some text. Well, this text results in a certain number of tokens. It actually gets turned into tokens, and you can see down here how many tokens this text is that I just put in here. How does text convert into tokens? That tokens are a vector math based representation of the text, and there's no, it's not like 5 characters turn into a token. But if you think syllables, that's not exactly right, but it gives you a good idea of what it is. And so all this stuff is priced per 1,000 tokens. And there's the price is published in Azure. Like, each model has different prices. It goes from, I think, 4 cents per 1,000 tokens for the most expensive models to 0.000001 cent per 1,000 tokens for the less capable models. So picking the right model is going to be an important skill to have. So that's Azure AI Studio, and this is getting into OpenAI through Azure. And we could now go into Visual Studio, back to this code base here, and see how to interact with this. And some other examples that I had, I show Python code, which is very common, but we are at the Stata.net presentation, so I'm going to use .NET code. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the OpenAI SDK to this service that I have set up in Azure, and I'm now interacting with it. So the first thing I do is I set up a system message, which is that thing we had in OpenAI here, where I said, hey, you are an AI that answers in a single word. Well, here I set it up differently. I said, hey, you're a friendly and funny chap, used to amuse an online audience. You respond as if you're John Cleese from Monty Python, but said in an old English medieval way, so an old medieval peasant, basically. And I'm using one of the models I've deployed. And then I start, this is just a console app, and I just get console input. And as you get input, I then send that into OpenAI and have an answer. And I just go round and round and round until somebody types exit. And so I could pop that up and I could show that and I could say hello, and this sends it into this chat API, and it responds back, verily greetings and salutation to thee, my good comrade. How does thou fare on this fine day? So it takes this instruction that I gave it to pretend to be John Cleese, essentially, and I could now interact with it, and I could say, tell us a short story, and it would go on and come up with some completely original new story in the voice of John Cleese. And in this case, I'm getting all the response at once rather than trickling it in like ChatGPT does, but I could do that as well. The advantage of getting it all at once is that I can then check it and have the AI actually check upon itself. And so there's different ways of doing this. But so it comes up, and I'm not going to read through this story, but you can watch the recording later and see what it actually said. So that's the very basics of interacting with it. And you can see creating a simple chat client completely from scratch takes a handful of lines of code. It's not very difficult. And by the way, you could probably have GitHub Copilot write that for you and then fine tune it a little bit. So not a difficult thing to do. Goes back to the question we had before. I'm a new C# developer. How do I do that? It's just not very hard. Okay. So that's what this thing does for us. And now we could use that to do things like developing Copilot. So let me show you a few things that we are currently doing for our own business. Okay, and I'm going to start with an example that's kind of the low-hanging fruit for a lot of people. And what this is this is a product we have that is used to create documentation, whether that is documentation for a technical product like the one I'm about to show you here. For those of you who've ever used Code Framework, you're probably aware of this. This is the same thing that you find on docs.codeframework.io. And this tells you about how to develop, in this case, Windows apps or API-driven apps using this Code Framework, open source framework product that we support. And this is the documentation for it. But this documentation engine is used for a lot of things. It's used for knowledge bases that companies use for their institutional knowledge. Is used for other product documentation, employee manuals, whatever. It's just a documentation engine that pulls together information from all kinds of sources, whether that is markdown files, HTML documents, PDFs, but also live data. So one of the things this can do is it can go, for instance, into a Git repository and pull out work items, like a work item backlog, and present it as part of this documentation. And it's up to the second live data, right? It's just real-time data. And so the interesting question is, well, how do you start searching that and create interesting stuff? And so what we've done here is we've added a Copilot here, and I can go into this Copilot and start asking it questions. So I could say, okay, I'm a Code Framework developer. I want to build a Windows application, and I want to create a new view, in other words, a UI, that is automatically laid out, because that's one of the templating styling features that this supports. And I want to hook it up to data on the back end and do data validation at the same time. So I can say, can you provide a code sample showing how to use an edit form for automatic layout and bind the elements to properties on a view model with data validation. And I go ask, and it takes a moment, and the UI is horrible. Please ignore the UI here. I'm just showing you how the sausage is made, basically. So this will have a completely different UI by the time we actually put this out, and it's also currently very slow, and we do a lot of checking and then come up with the whole thing at once rather than the trickling effect that you would normally see. But that's not the point. The point is that this now went into the documentation base we had that is 100% ours. And this thing is also instructed to not answer any questions that are not code framework related, because that's what this particular knowledge base happens to be about. And so what we're doing is it asks this question. We then need to go into our knowledge base and find the appropriate document. So it created a search term for this. And again, the user wouldn't necessarily see this, but this is our internal version at the moment. So what we do is we use other AI. We figure out the intent of the user. How do we do that? We use an AI. We use a large language model. We call into OpenAI to figure out what do they want to do. Oh, they want to search information about how to build an AI. Okay, what would be a good search term for it? That's a difficult task. How do you come up with a good search term that will give me back documents that are related to what the user wanted? Well, the simple answer is you ask a large language model. So the large language model came up with this search term here. We therefore could use something like Elasticsearch or Azure Cognitive Search or anything else you might have that allows you to search documents, which is a lot easier if it's AI driven. That's why I'm saying once you start with AI, everything becomes AI. But it's also conceivable to say, well, here is an API I have. It has the following input fields. Hey, large language model, what do you think a good way to call this API would be? And it would actually come up with useful information. But long story short, now that we know the intent, now that we know what documents might be relevant to answer this question, which is several different ones. We have documents in our documentation about how to bind data. We have other documents about how to write view models. We have documents about how to build user interfaces. And it inspected and comprehended all of those. And it then came up with an example specific to our framework as to how to build that. And that is much more likely to be correct, especially if I have it check on itself, than just answering, just using GitHub Copilot or just ChatGPT, because it is grounded using this pattern called retrieval augmented generation. It's grounded in the information that we specifically have in this knowledge base about this, and it's not in danger of accidentally putting in information that comes from a completely different framework or technology. So that's pretty cool when you think about what we just did there, comprehending what the user wants, finding other documents live, real time at this very moment, not pre-trained, adding that information to the large language model and then letting a large language model reason over this specific information only and coming up with a meaningful answer. Is this a question online is this a verbatim sample from your knowledge base, or is it synthesized from the various results that your search service returned? It is synthesized. It's on the fly coming up with new information that's not as such in the knowledge base, but that it can learn from the knowledge base we have. So you will not find a single document that had this example, but you could go through it and probably find 10 different documents that were related and did something similar, and then it came up with that answer and synthesized it, generated it right at that moment and gave a meaningful answer. So that's cool. Now you could do some of this stuff a little simpler. You could fine-tune models. If you have, say, an employee manual in PDF, you could just fine-tune the model and let it reason over that document. You upload it, it doesn't change. That's also a thing that people do a lot, where they write copilots that just go into this more semi-static information, and that's very useful as well. A lot of our customers are doing that. But this would be taking it a step further and on the fly doing this with real-time data. So that's pretty cool in itself. Now let me take this a step further and let me show you what we are doing within some of our applications. So what I'm going to show you now is an application that we use in-house to manage our business. It's called Olympus. Olympus is one client application into our own system. So we use this to run things like our staffing operation, our magazine business, our customer databases, our anything, your invoices, anything we do as a business goes through the system, and Olympus is one of the apps we have that runs that. And I like to show that because it's an older app, and so it's kind of a cool real-world example of how you can add that to existing information. We also have web clients and mobile client companion pieces that are going in, but people for some reason like using this Windows application. And so we can come in here, and one of the features that I like to show is our article database. So this is where we maintain articles that we have written for Code Magazine. And I always pick this one article. I'm not sure why I'm always picking the same one, but it's just one that I have been using. And you could look at this article online. So here is that article that was written by our editor, Rod Paddock, and it goes on the website, and it was printed in the magazine at some point. It's a really old article, actually. In fact, we can see here that the abstract says this is Rod Paddock's July-August 06 editorial. Doesn't tell us much about what it is, but I had some editor go in and actually put in this description, so when somebody goes into an article search and we show a list of articles, we can at least show some information about what that is. But we also have the actual article content, which we maintain in Markdown. So that's the actual article, and this is a preview of how it will appear on the web. And what we can do here now that's kind of cool is we can bring up a Copilot. And this Copilot here uses a sidecar-based approach. So we built a Copilot into our old application, and we can now do things like some of these predetermined shortcuts, which is always nice to have in a Copilot interface. So when I click this thing, it goes and it actually sends a request into OpenAI and into one of the language models, and it says, please generate me an abstract. It gives it all this text here as part of this prompt. So rather than saying, hey, how are you doing? I'm saying, hey, here is an abstract, give it all the text, or excuse me, here's an article, I give it all the text, and then I say, pretend you're a technical writer who understands technical content, create me an abstract for a technical audience, and then give me the result. And so it gave me this result here, and I could now say, oh, this is cool, or change it a little bit, or in this case, I'll just say accept it, and it then sticks it in here, and now I have a much, much more meaningful and in many cases very accurate information or very accurate abstract about this particular article. So that's awesome, right? And I could now tell it, no, this was not good, do it again, come up with a slightly different version, come up with a longer or shorter version, make it more or less exciting, all those types of things. But it's now feasible for me to create abstracts for all the articles because it can comprehend, think about that for a moment, it can comprehend what's in our article content. And I could do other interesting things, like let's start a new Copilot session here, and I could do something like I could say, do we have any similar articles in our database? And I know it's hard to read, but I'm reading it out loud here. Do we have any similar articles in our database? Question mark. And I hit enter. And what we now do is we have to detect the intent. So unlike the other one where we knew we just used, the content of the article that we already had, and now had to comprehend what the content of the current article was to understand what a similar article would be. It thus then came up and said, okay, similar articles would be about T-SQL innovation, SQL Server language replacements, things like the CLR and link queries and so on. So we used this system of a large language model to detect the intent of the user's question in combination with the current article content. We could then go into our database of articles using Azure Cognitive Search in our case, or something like Amazon's Elasticsearch. We then retrieved all the articles. We then took the abstract of, or the content of all these articles, create a large prompt, a large piece of text that says, okay, here's all the articles we have, here's the current articles, here are the other ones. Now answer the original question, do we have similar articles? And it then comes up with this answer. And it says, hey, we have these articles, and I even integrate that, and that's an important piece. I'm integrating it with the host application, so I can click on one of these guys, and now I can bring up this article and see, well, what is this article about? Oh, it's SQL Server. Okay, that's cool, that's clearly related. I could also say things like, why is the first article on the list? And it will then give me a reason, and it knows the overall context of what we are talking about, and it'll give me a reason. It says the first article discusses the conclusion of the author that T-SQL should be replaced due to several developments, blah, blah, blah. So it goes in and it gives me a technical explanation of why it thinks those two articles are related. Okay? So think about what I've just shown you here and think about how you would code this without AI and how, again, 6 months ago, this would have been complete science fiction. Okay? And there's a question online, would it be hard to train a custom model on all your articles and have a conversation about any topic within the article database? No, well, it's not trivial, and we wouldn't train a model. You do not retrain large language models because I don't want to spend $250 million and build 5 large warehouse-sized data centers to create a language model that takes 9 months to train, which would be completely infeasible for the obvious reasons, but also we publish articles all the time. I can't have a 9-month training phase when I publish something daily. So what we do instead is you can fine tune a model, which is kind of additional training, but even that we don't do here. What we do here is we retrieve additional content and then inject that into the prompt with a technique called prompt engineering. And this prompt engineering is a general technique, but then also pulling content in and stuffing the prompt, so to speak. That's called retrieval augmented generation. It has this horrible acronym of RAG. But that's what we're doing here. And so with that, yes, we can absolutely have it reason over anything we've ever published. And that's essentially what we're doing here. Now, a lot of people say, well, you got really lucky because what you have in your database is articles, and articles are all about language. What we have and what most people have is rectangular data. We have data in a SQL Server database, an Oracle database, something like that. And we want invoices with line items and so on, and we wanted to reason over that. You can't do that, can you? Well, I'm glad you asked, because let me show you another example. So here is our interface we use to query people. So I could go in here and say, what data do we have about myself? And here are my records. I have several different records in our database, and I could now drill into it and see all the things that we have on record about myself. So here's loading that record, and that has a lot of information. It has my addresses and categories I'm in, and subscriptions I own, and magazines I got, and events I attended, and articles I wrote, and invoices I got, and so on and so on. You get the idea, right? So there's probably 20, 30 tables involved, or maybe more, with all this information about myself. So how do I reason over that with the Copilot? So we built in this Copilot here. And I can do the following. I can say, what customers do we have in the database from Microsoft who attended any of our events and or have a magazine subscription? Okay, now think about that. How would you do that in a world without AI? How would you even come up with a query, or how would you provide an interface that allows your customers to query that, right? But we have our database in SQL Server. We also created an index over that that is just in sync with our database in SQL Server. Now, we could have probably also gone directly into SQL Server, but it's a lot easier if you have some kind of intelligent search index. In our case, we use Azure Cognitive Search also for this on top of our rectangular data, so that's doable. So I can now use this to get all the people from Microsoft that have attended any of our events or magazine subscriptions. Now, if I do that, obviously I have a little bit of a data privacy problem if I show you those names, but I can do something like this. Replace all the actual names with fake names. Okay, because it's a language model and it will understand. And so now we trigger that, and it detects the intent. Oh, we want to look for something that includes magazine subscribers and event attendees, and they are from Microsoft. And now it goes into our database and it comes up with this list. Okay, and so it comes up with 14 people that are both event attendees and subscribers from Microsoft. And by the way, it's fine for me to show these names, because note at the bottom it says, please note that the names provided are fake names, because I instructed it above to only, replace everything that looks like a name with a fake name. Well, that's kind of cool. Like, how would you, it's a language model. It can be intelligent. And so that's kind of cool, right? And now I can say, provide a list grouped by event, and then show each attendee first name only, and add was active magazine subscriber at the time if they had an active subscription at the time they attended an event. So I wanted to match names to events, show me a list of events. Underneath it, show me the first name, which it sometimes gets right and sometimes doesn't. I hope it does, because then I can show you something further. And then I wanted to match the time and date that they attended the event, and then look in our magazine subscription database and determine the range on which they had a start end date on which they had a subscription. So did they have an active subscription at that point in time when they attended the event? So let's see what it does with that. And you'll notice that I don't trickle in the response here. That would be an option which would UI-wise be nicer, right? So it comes in and we see it. But we don't want it to do that. We just wanted to show the result. And here it is. Here's the result, and it did it correctly. So we know that, for instance, this Psy person, which is a fictitious name replacing the original name of the customer, it still remembers that. And they came to this State of .NET Microsoft Web Development event and was an active subscriber at the time. Other people, like Mike, attended this event but was not an active subscriber at the time, which is why it didn't add that. Think about what you've just seen. We were looking on the fly using a Copilot AI. We're looking on the fly into live data stored in SQL Server that we had a search index over. We then match that. We consider probably 20, 30 tables in the process. We create a meaningful result that matches the intent of the user, the intent of which we detected using an artificial intelligence. We thus came up with this context that it can then use. And then all the rest of the functionality we've just seen is essentially emerging behavior. I didn't code the ability to hide the real names. I didn't code the ability to understand matching event with a subscription date range that indicated they were active. That is emergent behavior that we get because we're dealing with something that to some degree is intelligent. Now think about that. How would you have done that again 3 months ago? Absolute science fiction. And now we could even do stuff like we could say, what do you know about the first person in the list? Speak in the voice of John Cleese of Monty Python. Feel free to be funny. And again, it's this, I never coded this into it. It's just emergent behavior that results out of that setup, right? So, oh yeah, indeed, we have here in the database the one and only blah, blah, blah. I must say, sounds like quite the active magazine subscriber, oh boy. Attending events, keeping up to date with the latest developments, good show, jolly good show, and so on. It's now pretending to be John Cleese making a funny statement about this person, but still based on factual data from within our database, although I instructed it to not actually use a real name, which is nice because otherwise I couldn't demo any of this to you. And so I don't know, maybe I'm easily excited, but if you really think, if you think through what it takes to build that, I think your mind should be justifiably blown. And this is very doable. This is doable within your own applications. I'm not saying it's super easy, but it's very doable. And again, we have a whole class, a day-long class where we are showing how to build that, and that's coming up in 3 months. And also, I just don't have the time. I'm already way over my time again, as I usually am in these Data.NET presentations, but I hope this is of interest to you. I don't have the time to show the code, but if you go back to my Code Presents class, or Code Presents webinar that we did a few weeks ago, codemac.com/codepresents, it's a free recording. You can go to the part in the later, it's about, I think, an hour and a half in, where I actually show a lot of that code, how this is done. And of course, we'll show a lot more of that in our training classes as well. But that other content is free, so you can get a first glimpse of that. So that's amazing. I mean, think of what I just did. Think of the power I now gave my employees that use this application to do interesting things with the data we have. Is it a 50% productivity increase? It's far more than a 50% productivity increase. It allows us to do things and to serve our customers that we simply couldn't have done before. It enables us to be a better company. And that's really the key point there. Okay. Here is a little bit of information that I put in. By the way, you can download this slide deck afterwards. This is how the flow works, right? Every Copilot works like this. You get a request, you figure out the intent using AI. You curate the intent to make sure it's not content that's inappropriate. You then often retrieve and ingest additional data using this RAG pattern, or sometimes you will fine-tune the model or use other technologies like LangChain, and there's a number of different ways to do this step. Then you prepare the answer. You often then curate the answer to make sure it is right. Because if one of the steps that happened here, it didn't just use first names, even though I asked it to use first names only. But I could then say, did you do this right? And it'll say, oh, no, sorry, I provided a full name, even though it was a fake name. I should do it again, and here is the, and then it gets it right. So I could curate the answer for appropriateness, for correctness. And then I generate the output. And then I just repeat that process ad nauseum. That's how Copilots work. Okay. Now note that you can use the same technology for many other scenarios. We're talking almost exclusively about Copilots these days because that's the new application paradigm. But you can do other things with this. For instance, one of the areas of business that we are active in is maintaining and converting legacy applications from old technologies to a new platform. And we have tools for that to analyze code. We are now using AI to not just get hard stats like lines of code and commands and classes and reports and database tables and so on, but we use AI to say, how difficult will it be to convert this code base to another technology or a specific technology in question? And we get specific stats and let OpenAI type language models reason over code examples, which works amazingly well. So that's just one other example of things that we are doing. And we are still training custom models. So using technologies like ML.net, you often train other models because, like I said, once you are in this AI world, everything becomes AI. So if we are in, say, we're working with an energy company and we want to know how much electricity is being generated by our solar farm, well, and you know, which solar farm that we run is the most efficient for what we need in this scenario we're working with. Answering that question will require other AI models that are incorporated into that process. And then there are standard models. It's not always about running models on Azure or any other cloud. Often the smaller models you can download and run on a machine or an IoT device. And that works with some of the OpenAI models as well. It doesn't work with GPT because we're talking petabytes of data that you'd have to download and run somewhere. Nobody does that, and you can't. But some other models are available as quote unquote open source, even though I think the open source name or moniker that we use is completely wrong for AI type of technology, but it's what people use. And so you'll compose things out of all of those. And there's a question online, can you walk me through the processing path for an article example? Prompt sent to, you know, how many credits were used and so on. I did that in the Code Presents presentation to some extent. I'd be happy to take that up offline. Feel free to contact us. I'm happy to meet with you and do an online meeting. If you're sitting there now thinking, this is cool stuff, I wonder if that would work for us. I wonder how that applies to us. I can't go into all these examples, but contact us. Send me an email. Send an email to info@codemac.com. We'll set up a meeting with you. First come, first serve. Admittedly, we've been very busy answering these questions, but happy to set up a meeting with you to discuss how does this apply to your specific scenario. What are the low-hanging fruits? How can you get into this with some simple scenarios? You don't want to engage into a 2-year AI project. What you want is you want to start adding AI that's useful in this maybe a week or 2 project or something like that. So I'd be happy to show you some of that code, and I'd be happy to make suggestions as to what would be useful for you, because we now have a lot of experience doing this. We have production experience, which is unusual in how this stuff can work. So feel free to consider us a resource, and I'd be happy to set up a meeting. And we are not the kind of company that's going to send you an invoice just because we meet with you for a little bit and discuss some of these things. All right. Few things that I recommend you watch. Going back, all of this content is inspired by Build, but here are some things that I specifically think you should take a look at. Watch the keynotes. If you do nothing else, watch the keynotes. The day one, there were like 3 different keynotes that really added up to one full keynote. They're all worth watching. Day 2 started a little slow on the keynote, but the part where Panos explains how Copilot works in Windows and shaping the future of work with AI, as they called it, is very, very much worth watching. It was a very exciting presentation to watch in person. Then the OpenAI guys did a state of GPT session that tells you a lot more about how GPT works. Highly recommend it. Mark Rusinovich did an Inside Azure Innovations talk. Here is a tip. Every time you see Rusinovich talk or have a chance to see him talk, pay attention. They're always great sessions. So again, he had a great session there. There's a lot of specific sessions. I don't have any particular ones to pick out because they were all roughly equally as good. But if you're a Power Platform guy, go watch the Power Platform and Copilot sessions. If you're a C# guy, watch that. If you're a Python guy, watch that. So a lot of sessions were roughly equal in terms of the different things you can watch. And then day 3 had a closing session, and I was, it was the 3rd day. I was tired. I wasn't sure if I should still go, and the name was kind of dopey. The session is called Scott and Mark Learn to Code. Well, I'm like, okay, I don't need to see that. It turns out this is Scott Hanselman and Mark Rusinovich, which is why I ended up going, is because Mark was in there. And what they did is they showed how to use GitHub Copilot as well as many other AI technologies, such as OpenAI's DALL-E to generate original art. And they showed how to basically code a game from scratch in the browser, a multiplayer space shooter game, by basically having GitHub Copilot code it for you and walking GitHub Copilot through creating this whole application. It ended up being one of the better sessions, absolutely mind-blowing. Go watch it. It's entertaining, it is cool, and it's informative. So those are some of the sessions that I pick out to learn more. And there's a question online, is there a roadmap to suggest to folks what they want to invest in their AI career? I don't have a roadmap ready to go as such. But again, the things that we invest a lot of time in is understanding how to use, not how they work, but how to use large language models, how to talk to them. It's called prompt engineering. And just about any reasonably technical person can learn that. You don't even need to be a developer for that. Then, of course, you do need to be a developer to actually call it. But that's, if you understand Python or C# and you know how to make a call into a web API, which is not very hard, that's a good piece of knowledge to have. And then you can tie that together, and now, of course, it becomes building it into your app. And one of the harder things that I find is building an actual UI. The UI is deceptively simple, but it's super flexible because you need to come up with answers. The answers may include samples. So just yesterday I discussed with an oil company, can we build a Copilot that comes back with certain results and gives us a preview that renders a visualization of our oil well and how it's been drilled. Well, creating a UI that is flexible enough to incorporate all that and then drive all the applications involved, that's some hardcore development there. So that's not necessarily trivial, but I don't know that that fits into a roadmap for AI development. But just starting to understand some of this stuff, again, I'm going to beat our own marketing drum a little bit here. We are doing a one-day class. You can find that at codemac.com/training coming up in 3 weeks. I'll be teaching it. It'll be a full day of a lot of code, a lot of prompt engineering, a lot of calling other AI models. But it should be very digestible and not very difficult for people to understand as long as you're somewhat of a developer. And then there's some free stuff we've done, like my Co-Presents presentation that I did, I think, 2 weeks ago or so, which is completely free. And again, I'd be happy to talk with you about a lot of this stuff as well. Here are some recommended reading books that I love. AI Superpowers. It's a little bit older, but it talks about how different players, especially China and the US, are positioned to operate in an AI world and who isn't well positioned. Super Intelligence is a book that's a little hard to read, little theoretical, little out there, but if you have extra time, I recommend that as well. AI 2041 is cool. It's a book that is 10 examples and visions of what AI will be able to do for us in the future. And what's cool about it is it's actually 10 short stories that are like novel style, just science fiction type of stories. They're all short stories. And then the second half of each chapter is actual technical facts. How can that work? What does it take to implement that? So it's half science fiction, half technical content. Very cool to read. And then I also recommend 1,000 Brains, which is written by Jeff Hawkins, who is the founder of Palm Computing, the first, for some of you are probably too young to remember Palm Pilots, but the guy that invented basically the mobile device space is really at heart a neuroscientist and returned to his field of neuroscience and is studying the brain and especially the neocortex with an eye on how does all this work and how does it relate to artificial intelligence. So it's basically neuroscience for lay people. It's an easy read, surprisingly, for neuroscience, and I highly recommend it to anyone. It's very cool book. So these are 4 books that are standout books to me to read in general about AI. And that takes me to the end of the presentation. I'm way over my time again. Sorry about that, but I hope this was very interesting to people. A few other announcements. We've already talked about this training class. I'm going to skip over that. So a bunch of events coming up here in addition as well. Again, you could do us a huge favor in filling out your survey. Tell us what you like and what you don't like about Stata.net events and other webinars and live events we are doing. Helps us shape the future of these events we are putting on. Recording slide decks are available to download at these sites. If you are signed up for this event, we'll send you a follow-up email with all the download links in it. Here's just a little more information about stuff we're doing. I personally spend probably 80 hours a week these days doing AI stuff. We have this thing that's on here. It's on here as Code Skunkworks. It's actually called Code Labs, but we internally refer to it as Skunkworks, where we do a lot of these research type of things, and it's a lot of fun. You can find out a little more about that at codemac.com/AI. And again, feel free to contact us if you wonder how any of this stuff relates to you. I'm having the time of my life. I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've never had as much fun. And I'm I don't remember being as willing to stay up and do all-nighters even when I was young as I'm now. It's just, you blow yourself away with the stuff you build. It's tremendously exciting and a lot of fun. Code Magazine subscription you get for free if you came to this event. Feel free to pass this link on to your friends as well. No strings attached. It's just a free offer. And that's it. Again, I'm way over time. I apologize. I've been doing this. We should really put these events on for 2 hours. But I get carried away because I get excited. I hope this was useful to you. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Markus@codemac.com is my email address now. Word of warning, I'm always behind in my email. If you need a quicker answer, contact info@codemac.com so my people can step in and answer more quickly than I'm able to at this point. But I will respond back to you as well if you contact me at markus@codemac.com. I just can't make any promises on how quick. And that is it. I'll be hanging around a little more in case there's more questions. Other than that, thank you very much for attending. I encourage you to look into that. Have some fun with this. It's a awesome new world. Go watch some build videos online. Go watch our videos online. It's an exciting time. Be part of it. This is gonna shape the future. We're living through history. Couldn't have more fun. So go code. Thank you very much.